During the course of the revolution, there were significant figures who would write to each other and say, if we don't take charge of this, we're going to literally lose all control over this.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Harvey J. Kaye is the Ben and Joyce Rosenberg Professor of Democracy and Justice Studies at the University of Wisconsin Green Bay, an award-winning author of numerous books, including Thomas Paine and The Promise of America, and recently Take Hold of Our History, Make America Radical Again, both of which I've read and am a fan of. But most importantly and illustriously, he is our next guest. Professor Kaye, thanks for talking to us today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And I want to say one little tiny correction. I am Professor Emeritus of Democracy and Justice because a year and a half ago, I decided to retire. It was a voluntary decision, but I felt compelled or coerced into doing it by the pandemic. As I could not go into the classroom to teach and would have to do it online, I understood that I could possibly do it, but I thought I could accomplish more if I was doing conversations with folks like you guys.
Gotcha. Okay, well, I appreciate that correction, and I do appreciate your time. I know that you do a lot of stuff like this, so we do appreciate it.
Well, let me just say that I'm a labor unionist. I belong to the American Federation of Teachers, right now the retired section, you might say, and if I get a request from labor, that takes priority.
Nice. Well, we definitely appreciate it. And I am a former history teacher myself, so having you on is definitely a great thing for me personally. So
fantastic.
If nobody else enjoys it, I'm definitely going to enjoy it today.
So, Harvey, a big part of your life's work is trying to wrest a sort of admiration for the history of the United States and the use of its history from the hands of the right wing in this country. Can you talk to us about why it is that the right has such a firm hold on these things today?
Well, first of all, they've been very aggressive about it. Let's face that. And we could talk about it throughout American history, but let's talk especially about what happened in the course of the 1970s. And I fully accept that a lot of people may not even have been born yet in the 1970s. But that's about the time I was finishing my PhD. I was looking for a university job, and it was very evident that what became known as the New Right was going to do everything in its power, literally, to hijack the American past. And what I mean by that is that they were going to tell a story of the making of America that would literally suppress the memory of the struggles that went into the making of the freedoms, and especially the story of the making of the democratic achievements of the generation of the 1930s and the generation of the 1960s. And the 60s I was late in the 60s as a college student, but I was very much a part of that generation. And moreover, what was really fascinating about it is that this was an initiative, an effort that, though common across the right wing, was really led by the man who would become president in 1980, Ronald Reagan. I mean, I think for a start, the liberal and left political spectrum could not get serious about Reagan. They couldn't quite grasp his capacity to harness the past for the purposes of arguing for lower taxes, the deregulation of capital, the busting up of unions, you name it, and he was prepared to do it. And frankly, what happened is that it wasn't just their energy on the right, and it wasn't just the fact that they were a well-funded set of initiatives by the right, which, by the way, all too often centrist, soon to be known as neoliberal Democrats, bought into it all. It's also the case that on the left, there was an almost knee-jerk reaction. In other words, the left had gotten almost cynical about the American past. In other words, or most of the time was spent on decrying the exploitation and the oppression, the faults and failings in the American story. And as a consequence, when the likes of Reagan and others celebrated the American story as divinely ordained, as a story of, capitalism and individualism and all it provided for Americans. When they would do those kinds of things, the response by the left was a kind of knee-jerk one to remind everyone of how awful the American story has been. Now, I'm not saying all historians did this, but what I'm getting at is the common response in a public fashion was to decry the hijacking of history, not by challenging that hijacking, but literally by trying to deconstruct it alone, okay, to take it apart by referring to, the failure of the founders to end slavery, the story of labor movements that somehow had been marked by racist patterns and practices. Over and over again, it was a kind of embarrassment on the part of the left regarding the American story. And what we've seen is that it even continues to some extent today, and I'll be very blunt about it. You've got a major onslaught continuing by the right to try to control the teaching of history in the schools. And this has been going on since the 1980s, in fact. And their target is built around this idea that the 1619 Project is going to cultivate a disdain for the American story among young people. Now, no decent American history, and I'll say this first and foremost as a professor and a scholar, no decent telling of the American story would fail to come to grips with slavery, would fail to come to grips, for that matter, with the degree to which violence was used against both Black and, decidedly in many areas where segregation occurred, white workers as well. I mean, no history would avoid telling that. But the story that we should wish to promote, to my mind, is a story that asks, how is it that the American promise actually has been advanced in the course of 230 plus years? And what kinds of struggles went in to creating the makings of a democratic republic in the American Revolution? To remember the degree to which it was Black slaves leaving plantations and white workers recognizing that the viciousness and the vile character of slavery that enabled Lincoln, in fact, to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, and also led him to include inside the ranks of the Union forces. I know I'm talking to Alabamans, but you'll excuse this version of the story, I hope. 250,000.
It's the story we need to hear in Alabama, honestly.
Yeah, well, 250,000 African Americans, mostly, given their numbers, escapees from plantations in the South, but equally Blacks who wanted to serve the Union cause. And similarly, farmers from Wisconsin and workers from Pennsylvania. That's what enabled us to bring an end to the scourge of slavery. Now, history doesn't always move forward, no matter how dynamic forces of progress are. But it's also the case. Let's go to the 1930s and 1940s. I mean, we have a tendency, all the more these days, to not only run from the American story because of the horrors that did exist, but literally, as I said, to fail to assert, to advance the story of progress. And by the way, as a sidebar to that, we have a tendency on the left to want to take down heroes. We want to take down our own heroes. In other words, it's not only like, let's pull down a Robert E. Lee statue. Okay, we'll find reasons to take down the likes of a Lincoln statue in some parts of the country, or to change the name of schools from the names of revolutionaries to folks who might have a more sort of contemporary sound to them. Okay, well, let me come back. So the 1930s. So, I mean, notice I'm going to be referring to the Revolution, the Civil War, and the New Deal against the Great Depression and World War II. And the reason I say this is these were moments where Americans, despite all of our faults and failings, despite how much we left undone, these are moments that actually, if you like, reveal the very radical character of the American story. Because when the promise of America was mortally threatened in a universal fashion, so Americans found it in themselves to rise above the inequalities and the oppression, everything else, and not to be, if you like, blunted by all of that, but to actually save the American promise and advance the American promise by going radical. As I said, the makings of a democratic republic, the abolition of slavery. These made America freer, more equal and more democratic. And then in the 1930s, the worst economic and social catastrophe ever, in the Great Depression, they not only did they elect a decidedly progressive figure, Franklin Roosevelt, to the presidency, but they helped propel FDR even to go beyond the kinds of progressive initiatives he wanted to pursue. And really, I think we underestimate the degree to which the 1930s New Deal, both in terms of the initiatives by Roosevelt and the New Dealers and the Democrats, and all the more by working people in all their diversity, the degree to which that really did involve something of a revolution in American public life. Government would be responsive and representative to an ever greater extent of American working people. And we saw the enactment of Social Security. We saw the enactment of the National Labor Relations Act, which, by the way, the National Labor Relations Act, however weakened and devastated its powers are today, it was the case that when it was enacted, it placed the federal government not just in between capital and labor, it placed the federal government behind the workers' efforts to guarantee their right to organize. On top of that, think about the initiatives that the Rural Electrification Agency, which brought hundreds of thousands, especially of Southern farmers, the power of electricity because the private corporations wouldn't do it. So the REA created rural cooperatives. I mean, imagine the difference between having to worry about a barn fire versus the ability to turn on electricity in a safe manner to light a barn or to light a homestead. So these are moments that were created from the bottom up by, admittedly, if you like, revolutionary and decidedly radical and progressive leaders, but enabled those folks to do. I mean, I could go on and on. The point is that we need to, as I said in the title of that book, we need to take hold of our history. We need to remind ourselves of who we are and what we are capable of doing. I've lectured enough for a moment.
No, I think that is something that I have always been sympathetic to, and I have always been a bit off-put by some tendency. I think it's a rather minor tendency, but I do think there is a tendency on the left to dismiss the American story wholesale, and I've always been a bit off-put by that. We're about to run out of time here on the radio, but we are going to continue our conversation with Harvey J. Kaye online, so you can find us on Facebook or on YouTube if you want to continue listening to that conversation. Before we wrap here on the radio, I want to do a couple of plugs. I was on Ben Burgess's show on Monday, debunking anti-union arguments. You can find that on his YouTube channel. You can leave us a voicemail at 844-899-TVLR. We've got a new hat. If you want to go to our store, tvlr.fm, you can get that. Pre-orders in March 11th. It'll be delivered in mid-April, and you can become a sustaining member at the same place. Folks, that is it for our time on the radio. We appreciate your time, and we're going to be talking more to Harvey J. Kaye and Hayden Braxton on the other side. All power to the workers. All right, so we're off the radio now. Appreciate you staying. I think a little bit of that I got cut off a little bit on the radio, but that's fine. So we've got rid of the radio folks now.
And the FCC censors for whatever that's worth. Not Professor, not that we expect you to cuss up a storm, but you are welcome to now if you want to.
I'm actually more than capable of doing so, as my students will attest. But I knew that we were on radio, and I didn't want you guys to get fined in any fashion.
So, that is something that, you mentioned there is a tendency on the left to actually, to try to, in addition to taking down the villains of American history, to even take down, like some heroes of the American history, like Abraham Lincoln. And of course, if you get a full historical account of Lincoln, there are some things that would be like problematic in 2022 that he said, right? But it's also true that he was a big factor in the freeing of the slaves. And it seems like, if we're weighing people on the whole, what they did for America, certainly Lincoln was more good than bad. Where do you think that Where do you think that tendency comes from to be so critical wholesale of America and its history on the left?
Okay, well, I mean, obviously criticism is essential, so we're not going to discount the imperative of criticism.
Sure.
But, I remember back in the 70s, the sense that when you're losing, you want to punch when you're losing. You just want to punch out, okay? And when you're being constantly shoved backwards, it's kind of hard to get your bearings and start getting imaginative. So I don't want to psychologize it, but consider the fact that 45, I would have gladly talked about this on the radio, by the way, and don't hesitate to bring me back on radio so we can reach that audience. 45 years of class war from above takes its toll on the imagination. And it's also the case, and I'll be blunt about this, I'll make enemies when I say this, there have been works that were latched onto by the left as a way of promoting a more critical view of American history, which are troubled books. And I'm going to refer to the one that, people on the left always say, hey, I read that in high school. It was great. Howard Zinn's. Okay. Howard Zinn's People's History is a very troublesome book because if you read it, number one, you get the idea that progressive forces always lose over and over again. Second of all, he misrepresents the likes, say, of Lincoln and FDR. And he fails to appreciate the degree to which struggles from below have dramatically and seriously transformed American life. At the time, it seemed like it was this liberating work. But I think there were a lot of other works at the time, works by likes of Eric Foner and others, that probably offered an equally radical, but decidedly more progressive. And I don't want to say necessarily hopeful, but the American story has enough evidence for reason to hope. I used to say to my students, I'd say, I'm going to give you a whole series of days. You got to tell me what these are about. And I'd go, 1776 and 1865. I mean, I'd sort of lay out the obvious. And, it seemed like a trivial thing. And they would say, well, that was this, that was it. I said, yeah, but what do they all attest to? And what they essentially attested to is, well, for a start, we created an independent nation with the makings of a democratic republic. We founded ourselves to end slavery and empower, at least at the moments of the late 1860s, African-American men in that context. I mean, over and over again, there was this story that transformation had occurred. And I'm sorry to say this, and I know how people feel about it, but quite often you pick up Howard Zinn's book and it's not just a depressing story. It's a rather pessimistic understanding of popular power.
Jacob, I want to interject here.
I was actually going to ask you how you felt about that.
Yeah, as a history guy who did read Howard Zinn in high school and was inspired by that, I don't disagree with what you're saying because I felt like it was one of those where it led me to other what you would probably consider better works of history, because I think it is easy to read something like a Howard Zinn and just walk away depressed, for one thing, and what you're getting at, walk away without the sense of agency that people throughout time as, collective forces have been able to build progress. And no, it hasn't been linear. Of course, we've gone backwards and forwards, and I think sometimes that nuance is lost with that kind of interpretation of history or telling of history. And I do think that is partially what the right wing, has latched onto. And I see like a reaction to reaction to reaction in the literal sense of the word, as on top of the right wing reactionaries. And I think that is something that, all of us could maybe appreciate a little bit more. And there were a couple other things that you mentioned that I definitely wanted to respond to. And you mentioned the Revolution, the 30s, the Civil War, and what I see from those would be moments where the social contract in this country underwent, some sort of negotiation or change, however you want to, phrase that. And so I 100% agree. I think those are some of the most critical periods because that's where you can see where progress is possible. I think you can see where people who, yes, may be problematic by today's standards,
absolutely,
fought to make a more just world. And it's easy for us in hindsight, of course, to see maybe what we would have done different, what we think they should have done different, what they should have believed differently. But that doesn't take away from that story of collective struggle and changes to our broader social contract, which that leads me to, I guess, my next comment here, which you brought up the 70s. And, when I think of the 70s, I think of the triumph and the return of the right and the beginnings of a triumph of the right and neoliberalism more broadly. And I wonder, would you consider that along the same importance as these other eras we mentioned, the Civil War and the 30s and the Revolution, in terms of changes to our social contract?
Well, yes, in a general sense, and let's be very clear about it. It's one of those periods of reaction, not unlike in the late 40s when capital and the right did everything they could. Look, let's go back. So coming out of the American Revolution, the powers that be of that time, those who were even patriots, were really fearful of that the United States was going to become a real democracy. They were fearful of that.
Like scared of what maybe they had let out of the bag.
Oh, absolutely. Even during the course of the revolution, there were significant figures who would write to each other and say, if we don't take charge of this, we're going to literally lose all control over this. Because, for example, my hero, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, really did encourage people to believe that the revolution could truly create a democracy. Not merely a republic, but a democracy. Okay. Then if we go to the time of in the wake of the Civil War, we can define so much of this as a racist reaction once again, over and over. It's also the case that they were seriously afraid of white working class power as much as they were of a mobilized African-American people. And then let's go to the 30s into the 40s. Look, in the late 40s, the reaction to the New Deal pursued by capital and the right, which was not easily, by the way, the forces of labor and the left were pretty well organized. So it really took a hell of a lot of initiative to create the Red Scare, to force labor to purge of its ranks the more radical elements, the civil rights movement of its more radical elements. Now, it remained the case that labor remained a powerful force. I mean, by the mid-50s, 1 of every 3 workers was in a labor union, right? I mean, and then the promise was possible that public employee unionism would enhance the strength of working people all the more. I mean, I'm in the state, talk about irony, 1959, Wisconsin was the first state to accord to grant public employees the right to collectively bargain. That is, organize unions and bargain collectively. And then in 2010, with the election of Scott Walker and the Republican legislature, by the early 2011, they literally stripped us of our collective bargaining rights. So, of course, the moment, and I want to say that if we then think about the 60s, let's not fail to consider this. Everyone thinks of the 60s as youth movements and black struggles for civil rights, and then black power, the women's movement, gay and lesbian rights. It's also the case that workers were active on a grand scale. Strikes, okay, public employee activism inspired by the developments in New York City and Wisconsin. I mean, it really was the case that the 60s shook the hell up in capitalist circles, in studies that were not published on the left, but literally published by writers of the New York Times. It was revealed that in interviews with leading corporate executives, they were convinced that maybe capitalism could not survive if democracy grew ever stronger. And so the motivation to turn to so far to the right, even by business, which was always eager to do so, was incited by popular power. Look, people can see us on YouTube, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I do this occasionally. It's a show and tell, okay?
Nice.
Everyone thinks that
love show and tell.
Everyone thinks that if you hear somebody on the left mention, who's old enough to remember, the Trilateral Commission, which was organized by David Rockefeller, Zbigniew Brzezinski, had a vast number of members from Western Europe and Japan and the United States from the corporate and political worlds that included both George H.W. Bush and Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter was the favored son of the Trilateral Commission to run in 1976 and get the Democratic Party to nominate him for president and then contain the forces in the Democratic Party, especially labor. Well, this is the Crisis of Democracy report issued by the Trilateral Commission. And I want to make it clear that this report is not some little pamphlet. This is a major publication by New York University Press. They were proud of this report. And in this report, the central part is written by Samuel P. Huntington, who's now passed away, but he was a major figure in the Harvard government department. And what he talked about in this was that we were suffering a crisis of democracy because there was a democratic distemper, that we were suffering an excess of democracy, okay, that we could not afford this excess of democracy. And the Trilateral Commission was Republicans and Democrats. And in many ways, this is one of several initiatives, because the Trilateral Commission was not the new right. It was actually it was to the left of the new right, but it was only as far to the left as the center. These were corporate Democrats and Republicans, not new right types. And what they did is they laid out who the enemy was. They laid out public employee unionism. They laid out the civil rights movement and the poor people's movement that had begun under Martin Luther King Jr. in the late 60s. And it was also the women's movement. It was, the term they used was value-oriented intellectuals, basically humanities and social science professors at the universities. And they called it the liberal media, that all of these folks needed to somehow be contained so that democracy would not overpower the capacity of the elites to govern. And this has been underway. I mean, this was a dramatic transformation. This was the end, or if you like, a declaration of war on the democratic achievements of the 30s and the 60s. And it was initiated, keep this in mind, in the Carter administration, not the Reagan administration. In 1978, Carter turned his back on both the environmental, well, not both, on the environmental movement, the consumer rights movement, and the labor movement. Doug Fraser, who was the head of the UAW and a member of the Dunlop Commission, which was a commission of management and labor folks to discuss industrial relations in the United States, was a major sort of group. He quit and sent a public letter, okay, saying, I'm not going to sit on a committee where half the committee is basically pursuing class war on the rest of us. And that's what happened. And then Carter brought in Volcker as the head of the Federal Reserve. And a key word of neoliberalism is the word austerity. Who do you think used the term austerity in his speeches first? Not Reagan. It was Jimmy Carter. So Carter lost to Reagan in 1980 because vast numbers of working people said, well, hell, I'm not going to vote for Carter. What's the difference between Carter and Reagan? Reagan won with a very low percentage of the vote, but still enough to win. And what we've seen ever since is the Democrats have become subject to the money power, as the populists used to say, right? I mean, why, think about over and over again, Carter to Clinton to Obama, and Biden seemed like he might have been pushed to the left by Bernie. But what we've seen this past year is a kind of passive presidency, while the squad and other progressives were trying to get things passed in the House and the Senate. And what happened? We talk about Manchin and cinema, but don't forget Chris Coons, who was mentored by Joe Biden and is the senator from Delaware. He sort of led the charge against the $15 minimum wage.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you for laying that out there, because I think a lot of folks do gloss over that history, and I think it's easy to just look at the state of Democrats today without thinking about how it's evolved over these last several decades.
Let me give you one example to play into this history question. When Democrats run for president, yes, they make a lot of promises. They portray themselves as progressives. But I can tell you that there's always those moments when they reveal themselves, and it has to do with the representation of history, of the past. And I'll never forget this moment. You guys may not have been. How old are you guys?
Well, Adam's a lot older than me. I'm 25.
Right. So what is he?
I'll be 33 this year.
A lot old.
Yeah,
so
he's old.
33 years ago, when would you were not? Let's see. Carter was inaugurated in 1993. So you were just a little kid.
You mean Clinton was inaugurated?
Sorry, Clinton. Thank you, Clinton. It's all the same, you might say.
Yeah,
but
Clinton
anyhow.
was the first president I can remember. You know,
Okay.
I was alive for Daddy Bush, but I can remember Clinton, of course.
Well, I've written about this a few times because I'll never forget this. This was like an incredible moment when I heard what he did. So, Bill Clinton has a middle name. What's his middle name? Let's see if you remember.
He's William Jefferson Clinton.
You got it,
Is
William
that
Jefferson
correct?
Clinton. And William Jefferson Clinton decided that given his middle name and given the history of the Democratic Party that he was now the head of, as he was going to go to D.C. to be inaugurated, that he would reenact Jefferson's journey from Monticello in Virginia to Washington, D.C. for the inauguration. But he wasn't going to ride a horse or a donkey or anything like that. He was going to ride on a bus. So he makes this journey. And when he was running for president, he kept saying, you know, we need change in America. We need change. This was his big thing. I think hope and change were the two words he used a lot. The boy from hope, the man from hope, and he's going to bring change. So now we're at the inauguration, and he's giving the speech. And there's that moment in the speech, and I didn't watch it on TV. I was not a fan of Clinton. I voted for him because who else are you going to vote for? Okay, and I'm driving into the university. I've got it on the radio, and he says, as Thomas Jefferson said, in every generation, Americans need change. A moment comes where they need change. And I thought, it's all over. Because that's not what Jefferson said.
No.
What Jefferson said was, in every generation, Americans will need some rebellion. In other words, movement from the bottom up. I mean, for all of Jefferson's elitism as a slaveholder, okay, and as much as he actually had very little respect for urban working men and women, okay, preferred yeoman farmers, the fact was that he understood the degree to which you've got to defend democracy by fighting for it. So, and I thought, well, guess what? And then guess what he does, Clinton? Okay, here's what he did. The first thing he did when he was in the Oval Office, not a lot of people know about this, is he made a phone call to Richard Nixon because he wanted to talk foreign policy with Richard Nixon. Oh, well and good. Okay, fine. But then think about, he had promised to pursue national health care. And what did he do? He appointed Hillary Clinton to chair a commission to explore the possibilities of how to create a national health care system. And it was a private, every single meeting they had was held in private. It was not and in the meantime, what ends up happening? The insurance companies, the pharmaceutical companies, the Republicans, they mobilize, they're ready. Well, there was no mobilization of the American people in favor of what they've already voted for. Okay. Right. And I can give you other examples. And because we know that the Clinton years were truly the high point of neoliberalism. Okay. I mean, it was like the deregulation of the communications industry, the mass incarceration, the ending of the program that goes back to the New Deal, aid to families with dependent children.
Right.
I mean, over and over
Wall
again.
Street deregulation.
The Wall Street deregulation. I mean, it's over and over again. Some of it had already been forecast by Carter and Reagan, but it was like a holiday time for neoliberalism. And not to mention, back in 1933, FDR and the New Dealers had separated investment banks and commercial banks so that people's deposits would be secure, that they couldn't be subject to risky investments and playfulness by bankers. Well, the Graham-Rudman Act of the late 90s, I think it was Graham-Rudman, was a bipartisan thing that Rubin and his ilk, the Treasury Secretary, then followed by what's his name? Summers. Thank you. I'm talking to myself here.
Larry Summers, yeah.
Larry Summers, right? I mean, he signs into law, which enables the risk takers and the deposit holder banks to coalesce and basically pave the way for the financial crises that were to follow later, along with a host of other things that Democrats allowed to happen and Republicans took part in. My point is that at that key moment when he's being inaugurated, he revealed himself by his sense of history. Now, did he know that he was misquoting? Sure he did. He's a smart guy. He knew what he was doing. But one of the things that was revealed, which was revealed by all of these Democrats, not surprisingly Republicans too, but the Democrats we would have hoped for more from, is that they are essentially afraid of their fellow citizens. They refuse to engage and call upon their fellow citizens to become directly involved in pushing them forward. You know, FDR did that over and over again, regularly invited that kind of thing. The next major figure who did that at the presidential level, seriously speaking, was, if he had won the election, was Bernie Sanders. Not me, us.
Organizer-in-chief.
Organizer-in-chief. Not me, us. Think of that. It wasn't only the Christian idea, say, of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It was also the case of, I can't do this by myself. If I get elected, you're going to have to be outside the window demanding the enactment of the things that you will have voted for.
And you know, this telling of history is really interesting when you compare it to a popular understanding, because I have people in my family who voted for Jimmy Carter who cite Jimmy Carter as a reason that they are not sympathetic to the left. And in a lot of ways, he was like the first, like, or the I don't know if maybe you would even call him the first neoliberal president.
Oh, he was absolutely the first neoliberal.
You know,
yes.
And it's just not, you know, their understanding. It's just because he's blue. He's on the blue team. He had a D next to his name, and so that makes him the left. And so his presidency and the damage that it caused is therefore an indictment on the left, despite everything that you laid out.
Right,
here.
He was definitely not of the left.
Right, exactly. As someone who, I will admit, I am on the left, I do not claim him.
Yeah, I mean,
he's not on my
nice
team.
Guy.
He was not on my team.
Yeah, he seems like a nice guy, especially since he's left the presidency. But like, as far as his presidency, it's not what I would want.
But I think it's so important what you just laid out there, because it has been a bipartisan destruction of public sector, of social services, of all of those achievements that were fought so hard, that we fought so hard for in the 30s in the New Deal era. And we've just, you know, my entire lifetime, Jacob's entire lifetime has been this period of retreat by and large, or, you know, Democrats essentially offer up nothing more than management of the status quo, management of a declining status quo, as opposed to Republicans who promise to make it worse. You know, that's been really the political possibilities throughout our lifetimes. And so, not to get down the Bernie rabbit hole, but that was, you know, at least a breath of fresh air politically in terms of electoral politics, that there was both a conception of collective politics, of not me, us, on top of the actual policies that he discussed, from healthcare to, you know, any number of economic and social issues.
Yeah, I do want to say that I voted for Bernie. I've admired Bernie. I would have voted for him ever since I first heard about him in the 1980s. But I have one criticism of Bernie, because since we've been talking about the use and abuse of history, is that Bernie, in 2015-16, and then again in the 2019-20 primaries, at some point went national on YouTube to talk about the meaning of democratic socialism. I wish he had never bothered to use the term. He had to spend half his time talking about what it meant versus just saying, I'm an FDR Democrat, period. But the worst part is he'd have on his website, like, a recollection of an economic bill of rights that FDR proposed, of workers' rights that were part of the National Labor Relations Act. He would have on his website historical references. But when he would go before the American people in debates with Hillary or with the clown car of Democrats that he had to suffer, like Klobuchar and others, what did he do? He never even brought up Franklin Roosevelt, whereas the great Eugene Debs, the great labor leader and socialist Eugene Debs, when he had to appear in court to defend himself, and that basically the other Democrats turned it into a courtroom, and they said to him, "You want You want to bankrupt the United States when he mentioned something like Medicare for all. What Bernie should have done is he should have called into the room the memory, the image of FDR and said, what kind of Democrats are you? You sound more like Republicans of the 1920s than you do Democrats of the mid to late 20th century. I stand with FDR, who in 1935, when he signed into law the Social Security Act, wanted it to include health care, but was blocked from doing so by the American Medical Association, by many a Republican, and by all too many Southern Democrats in Congress who were convinced that if they included national health care, Southern hospitals would have to desegregate.
Right, and I think that speaks to we had a question in the chat. How does the right profit from controlling the history narrative? And I think that speaks to it, because history is like the Michael Brooks show. They had a segment called "History is a Weapon." I believe, or maybe that's the Antifada. I can't recall, but one of those shows had a segment called "History is a Weapon," and I think that it is a very powerful weapon in talking about in talking to a people, and so maybe you can kind of expand on that a little bit. Like, why is it that taking hold of what good does it do justice and democracy-minded people to take hold of history and to call FDR into the room and call the history of struggles in the United States? What good does it do us to call that into the room when we're talking to the Americans?
Well, I can always fall back on Orwell. Those who control the present control the past. Those who control the past control the present. What Orwell was getting at is the fact that, and I'll now refer to, I can't remember who said it, but I'll basically say history affords us a sense of who we are, what it demands of us, and moreover, it defines our possibilities, our imagination. Okay, in other words, human struggles matter. Look, one refers over their shoulder to the past, right? Rather than the way things are is the way it has to be, which becomes a kind of it's a mantra. The way things are is the way it has to be, right? Over and over again. That's the messages that are communicated in the media, in all too many advertisements, and over and over again. But what history does, it shatters the inevitability of the past having become the way it became the present, and it shatters the inevitability that the way things are is the way it has to be. It reminds us, basically, as you said earlier, of that human agency matters. Right? It does matter. There was this Henry Demers Lloyd. He was a progressive journalist and activist around 1900. And there was a line I came across of his, which I constantly fall back on it. It's like, if you ask people, what's the price of liberty? And they say eternal vigilance. You got to be protective of your rights. But Henry Demers Lloyd said, well, actually, democracy, rights, demands not only vigilance, it also demands action and struggle, because the rights that were afforded to us by he used the word fathers, we should say, the rights afforded to us by our fathers and mothers, our grandmothers and grandfathers, our great-grandparents. I'm thinking now the 30s, and for many young people today, the 60s. Those rights can only be defended if we fight and assure new rights for our children. The status quo is always a dead end.
Absolutely. On that note, Jacob, if it's okay, I'd like to just mention James Loewen, who wrote Lies My Teacher Told Me, and I think that could be a book perhaps subject to the same kind of criticism that you and others might have of Zinn's work. But, he passed away last year, and I was reading in Rethinking Schools, which is published up in your area, up in Milwaukee, I believe.
Yes, it is. Milwaukee, right.
Yeah, and they had a quote from Loewen that I just really, really love and wanted to throw out there and maybe, get some feedback from you about. James Loewen once said, "Telling the truth about the past helps cause justice in the present." Achieving justice in the present helps us tell the truth about the past. And, I was wondering if you could maybe expand on that dynamic.
I don't know if I can expand effectively on it. And I will tell you that when the book, just as in with People's History, when Lowen's first book, What Lies My Teacher Told Me, deconstructing, there's a real role for deconstruction. I don't want it to be like...
That's a very attractive title for a teenager.
Yes.
A budding radical teenager who's starting to question, all the narratives.
I'm going to tell you a little story, which I told my students. I wrote my hero is Thomas Paine. Goes all the way back to when I was 10 years old. At my grandparents' apartment. I'll make the longest story short and tell you, at my grandparents' apartment, there were times when my grandparents wanted me to leave the room when they were talking to my parents. And they would signal it in various ways. And what I would do is I would wander their apartment as if I was in the galleries of a museum. It's a much longer story. I'm keeping it brief. And I would always end up at the same spot in the back of the dining room in my grandparents' apartment. My grandfather was a trial lawyer in New York City, but at home he kept his personal library. And I came across a book. This isn't the exact copy. I found this in a used bookstore because it meant so much to my life. Can you read that? Let me see if I can.
We have Thomas Paine.
Author.
It says author of the Declaration of Independence.
Right. So here's a guy who was so infatuated with Thomas Paine. This is back in the 1930s or 40s. Who decided he was convinced it was really Thomas Paine and not Thomas Jefferson who wrote the Declaration. He wrote a whole book on it. Now, I'm 10 years old, and I see this book has a red cover in amongst all the dark covers of my grandfather's bookshelves, and I grabbed it, and I said, aha, my teachers are all wrong. And I made Thomas Paine my hero just by the fact that it would reveal my teachers to be liars, right? And so here I am now, a pretty well-known historian, but for much of my life, I never got 100 on an American Revolutionary History test because I constantly would write in a defiant manner, it was Thomas Paine who authored the Declaration of Independence. So, yeah, I fully appreciate that, young people, even older folks, can first feel unsettled, but then liberated by the revelations. But those revelations don't lead one to understand the imperative of agency. It only teaches one the necessary rule of skepticism. That's what it teaches.
And I think that's the key is being able to connect that to, yes, be skeptical and deconstruct some of the dominant narratives, but then what's next? What does that lead you to? And I think that's what you're speaking to.
Yeah, and look, as Jacob will tell you, having read this stuff, I mean, I've made it my life's work for many years now to try to not simply deconstruct, but to try to begin the reconstruction, I'll be honest, of an American narrative to the point where I can even be obnoxious about it. So, for example, I don't reject the idea of American exceptionalism. I have a completely alternative understanding of it. And my understanding of American exceptionalism is that, and this comes from, I trained in Latin American studies. I spent a good part of the 1980s into the 90s writing books about British Marxists who I greatly admired and who really taught me to rethink history, E.P. Thompson, Eric Hobsbawm, and others. And I also became friends with them and the executor of one of their literary estates. And I can tell you that I'm convinced that what really is extraordinary about the American story is the radicalism that characterizes this story. And I'll go back. Look, for all of the sins of Thomas Jefferson, his pen found its way to write life, liberty, and the promise, the American promise of equality and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I want to say that, people scorn that because look at the fact that they didn't bring an end to slavery, but they did over time in the North. Let's be clear about that. But I always had my students read Frederick Douglass. I assume you both know of Frederick Douglass, the great 19th century African-American who escaped slavery, became the greatest orator of the 19th century, and a leading abolitionist. And he delivered what I would call a sermon, but he gave this talk on July 4th weekend of 1852, I believe it was.
Yeah.
And it was titled...
That's amazing. Anyone who hasn't checked it out, you should.
What to the slave is the 4th of July, right? And I would tell my students, your weekend assignment is to read this sermon. He gave it in a abolitionist church, so I figured you could call it a sermon. And I could always tell who read it all the way through. They'd come in on Monday.
You can.
I come in on Monday, and I told them they have to just one question. They don't have to write an essay about it, though it would help if they could explain themselves in written form. Is Douglas a patriot or an antagonist to the United States? And they would all come in and say, well, not all, 75% would come in and say an antagonist, because look at how he attacked. And then the other 25%, and maybe I'm exaggerating the 25%, they would say a patriot, because when push came to shove at the end, he said he had not given up hope, that the American promise was so powerful a force that there was still dynamic hope for the United States. And, and it was simple. It wasn't like I was challenging their intellects. There were some who read it all the way through, and there were some who didn't. But I would tell people, if Frederick Douglass could find it in himself, in the midst of the antebellum period, in the midst of slavery, himself having to fight to get free and to escape bondage, and yet he came north and continued to suffer any number of racist moments. I mean, it's not like he came north to this utopian north,
right.
But he found it, and I think that that's the case. And when those slaves escaped those plantations, they didn't come north just to find an escape. They came north and they were volunteering for service in the Union Army, even if it just meant digging ditches, for trenches. But many of them ended up, wearing the uniform. I mean, those are the kinds of things. In the during World War II, there were those who worried that African Americans would not serve in the U.S. military. But African Americans were fighting for what they called the double V, the double victory. They were going to defeat fascism overseas, and they were going to defeat fascism at home, because they believed the promise was that powerful. Japanese Americans, look, my best friend who passed away, he was older than I, passed away several years ago. His father was in the U.S. Army, Japanese American, in the U.S. Army, while his son, my dear friend, was born in an internment camp in Arkansas. And,
wow.
And my friend and his father we would talk, he would say, there's no way we were going to allow racists to define us as anything but American. So, yes, there were those who refused to serve, but 22,000 did serve. And in fact, the unit, the 442nd, was the most decorated combat unit in World War II of purely Japanese American soldiers. So, there's a story there that we need to remind people of. When I talk about FDR, it's like a knee-jerk thing. I'll get people that come first. They say, "Oh, but he didn't. He didn't fight to end Southern segregation." But they don't realize that the New Deal initiatives, the bills that were presented by the New Dealers, did not themselves contain segregation. It was the Southern, sorry, I'm picking on you Alabamans with your ancestries, but it's the case. Southern Democrats were absolutely, they had a good nose for what was going to threaten segregation. So when Social Security came up, well, they couldn't do it on race because the 14th Amendment prohibited that, but they could on occupation. They excluded household workers and labor and farm workers, similarly with the National Labor Relations Act. But the story remains that African Americans were active and energetic unionists in the CIO industrial unions.
Yes.
Right? I mean,
right.
And in fact, the CIO championed interracial unionism. I could go on and on with this kind of stuff.
Well,
yeah.
And we could too, of course. But I love that you kind of left off there, because that's been a frequent topic of our show, is discussing the ways in which unionism and building a labor movement can break through some of the racial barriers and other barriers that we have in our society that have been instilled in us to prevent that very thing of class consciousness and class solidarity. And we see that with unions across the country now that have interracial membership. And we saw it, in these periods that you've written so much about, where perhaps one of the only, maybe the only integrated functions in town in some places were the early union meetings. Right. And we mentioned last week, we interviewed the Republican author of this quote-unquote anti-riot bill that's been going, some versions of this is happening all over the country. Yes. And that's something that I wanted to harken back to, is in Gadsden, Alabama, and the ways in which violent company thugs and others had suppressed not just the union drive, but the interracial aspect of the union drive, and seeing that threat. And I'll one last thing, and I'll shut up here. To throw back to something you mentioned earlier in terms of the 60s and the ways in which we kind of look at the 60s, I think it's too often that folks think of the 60s like you described in that way of like the youth movement, there's the Black Power movement, the women's rights movement, as if they are not completely overlapping with the labor movement. And, it's working class people who are in these other movements as well. I mean, that's not 100%, of course. But it's not as if all of these different struggles and these different movements are all in their own silos. There's tremendous overlap there. And it's, it's certainly obvious to me that justice for workers means racial justice and vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, right. I'll give one more historical reference, and then you can shut me up, okay? and that is that the reason that that Southern capital and the Southern Democratic Party were so utterly hostile to labor and were prepared to do, whatever it took to block labor organizers coming south in the late 1940s as part of Operation Dixie, is they knew, because Operation Dixie came out of the CIO. And for all of the racism that did prevail in many quarters of the labor movement, more so perhaps in the American Federation of Labor. But don't forget, the American Federation of Labor was also the labor federation that gave a home to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, A. Philip Randolph's union. And Randolph refused to leave the AFL for the CIO because he felt the AFL had opened up to black workers. But anyhow, it was the CIO that pursued Operation Dixie. Now, why were they so afraid? Because Operation Dixie, as a CIO drive, was an interracialist drive. And they knew that the labor movement would literally force an end to segregation far ahead of what they knew would ultimately be the end of segregation. I mean, they knew it was coming, and they were going to hold on as long as they could. Okay.
Right. Professor Kaye, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. I'm sure that we could continue talking to you for another hour or two. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Talk to you guys for
the whole day, man.
I would be down, but
I do hope that we can have you on again, though. I've really enjoyed it.
Yes, absolutely.
Guaranteed.
So yeah, thanks for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. You guys, look, solidarity is the key word. Okay, never fail to think of that one. Okay.
Absolutely.
Will do. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.